Today isn't an episode of Gateways, only because I'm going to be discussing musical history, the key features of particular times in musical history, according to Roger Paul in the IB Music Revision Guide. And the reason why I'm doing this is because for those of us in IB, we are going to be having our listening mock exams very soon. And it's very important for Section B to have an understanding of the key features of musical history so that you can identify when exactly a piece was written. Now, I will be going into the key features, but not as much the history itself. If you wish to go into the history itself, I recommend looking at the book, IB Music Revision Guide, or doing any further research. I'm merely just going to provide the basics on how to identify what era the piece of music is most likely from, so that it can be spoken about and fill out criterion D in the IB listening exams. So we're going to start off with Western classical music, which is split into multiple sections, beginning with the Renaissance period, which is around 1550 to 1600. So that's the mid 16th through 17th centuries. So most importantly, in Renaissance music, it's often written for voices. It's very vocal. It's a cappella or without accompaniment. And it's normally divided into one of two sections, either secular, so not for the church purposes, such as entertainment and dancing, or non-secular, which is church services. In the case of European culture, that would be the Catholic Church. At this time, melodies were mainly sung with the modes developed by the Romans and the Greeks. There was the use of some accidentals, but this is further developed later in the Baroque period, which will be discussed later in this episode. There's a lot of melodic movement, which is stepwise or chromatic, and a lot of the time, if there's ever a leap that's greater than the stepwise motion, there's often movement back into steps. So this is very important to keep in mind. If you see a lot of chromatic movement, then it is most likely Renaissance era. Now, alongside this, in terms of the vocal parts, they usually fall under polyphony or homophony. Now, polyphony is the use of multiple melodic lines weaving around one another to create harmony, and homophony is when multiple parts are singing the same line rhythmically. However, in terms of pitches and interval relationships, they are different in the different parts, which creates harmony. Now, pre-Renaissance period, this is very important to keep in mind. If you're trying to identify something which is pre-Renaissance period, it is most likely going to be monophonic or unison. So that means that there will be either a single pitch being sung or multiple pitches being sung in octaves from one another. So if you're looking at what could be medieval era music, then it is most likely monophonic. So that's a key way to identify the difference between Renaissance and pre-Renaissance. Now, there was also this antiphony that was used in the Renaissance era, which can be compared to modern day call and response, in which one group sings a melodic line and another group sings a melodic response. However, because you are discussing Renaissance era, you use the phrase antiphony, not call and response. Now, in terms of harmonically, it uses a lot of root position or first inversion chords. So that means that you either have the tonic on as the gravitational root, or you have the third as the gravitational root. In terms of cadencing, you have perfect cadences, which are 5-1, plagal cadences, which are 4-1, and imperfect cadences, which is when a piece ends on the dominant. And in the case of modally, you'll often see where like a minor mode will end in a major chord, and a way to refer to this is the tierce de Picard. Picardi, I don't know how to pronounce that, to be honest. It's also important to think about there's the use of like suspension which is important in that, like, with melodic lines interlacing in polyphony, suspension did occur. That's something to keep in mind, that seeing suspension does not automatically cut it from being Renaissance. They were used. And there was also the use of counterpoint melodic lines, as well as the use of structures as like variations of binary forms. So these are all very important to keep in mind if you're attempting to identify what type of music is. So go over again in brief. You have a cappella music written for secular or non-secular purpose, based in modes. It's polyphonic, homophonic, and can be antiphonic. Chords are normally root position or first inversion. You have perfect, plagal, and imperfect cadences. Minor modes will often end on major chords. Suspensions were used, and the development of counterpoint is used, and structurally, variations, binary forms, and strophic forms were used as well. So now moving on to the Baroque era, which is about 1600 to 1750. To begin, like, textures were a lot thinner, so this is known as monody, which, if you know, mono comes from the idea that it's singular. So that was kind of the beginning of the era. It became more polyphonic as the period went on. Probably the most recognizable feature of Baroque music is the continuo, which is a very foundational element, and it's when a bass part and a keyboard part, in this case harpsichord or organ, improvise chords for figures written below the bass part, which is where the term figured bass comes from. It's very recognizable. And above these continual parts, melodies were often written in long winding phrases, which are decorated with things such as trills, mordents, and turns, which can be seen written in musical notation. I recommend you look into what exactly those symbols are so that you can be prepared if you are observing a score in this exam. Now, alongside this, Baroque pieces often remain with one mood or affection from beginning to end, and contrast was often made by using instrumentation, for example, few instruments against many, or alternating loud and soft sections, which is known as terrace dynamics. And keep in mind, if a piece includes the phrases crescendo and diminuendo, it is most likely not Baroque music because they did not utilize those terms at the time. Alongside this, there was the higher provision of the violin family, which is very important. Keep in mind, before it was viols, but now it's the violin family. And woodwind, trumpet, and timpani were sometimes added to strings and continuo within this piece. So you see a growth in instrumentation around this time. And later into the period, at the start of the 18th century, the Greek modes that were used in Renaissance period, which consists of 7 modes, were reduced to 2, Aeolian and Aeolian, or major and minor. So you have a large reduction in the number of modes that were mainly used in composition. Of course, Bach is prevalent during this period, and then structures which are important, which evolved. So originally you have binary, so now you have ternary form, you have rondo form, you have ritornello form, and you have the fugue. What are these? Well, binary is AB, ternary is ABA, especially in the capo aria. Rondo is ABACA, or the repetition of A. You have ritornello, which is used by Vivaldi in his concertos, and a fugue, which is polyphonic texture. So, moving on from that, again, if you want to look into the history, I will actually find a PDF version of this book, and I will put it in the resources tab under the drive if you wish to read more. So moving on to the classical era, we have 1750 to 1810. Unlike the Baroque era, there is far greater use of homophonic textures, or melody and chords. They were a lot lighter and clearer than in the Baroque era, which is very important. There were still polyphonic textures, so don't assume that just because there's a greater use of homophony and polyphony that it's not Baroque era. Now in terms of its sound, it's a bit more elegant, polished, and well balanced structurally. This is very important. It's a lot more structured than Baroque music. Alongside this, you have like a wider range of contrast and variety. So you have you have different sections, different moods, unlike the Baroque period's use of kind of single affection. They create changes through changes in key, themes, rhythms, and dynamics. Melodic lines are often shorter than their Baroque counterparts. There's a lot more question and answer phrases marked by cadences. The harmony is still diatonic, but the use of chromatic chords like diminished seventh and augmented sixth starts to creep up more. You have the use of pedal points as well. Dynamics are now further developed. This is when you start seeing the terms crescendo and diminuendo and sforzando are now being used. So if you see those in a piece of music, it could be from the classical era. The harpsichord became somewhat obsolete as it was replaced with the classical orchestra woodwind section, which would be two of each flute, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons, as well as it was replaced by the piano due to its ability to play different dynamics. Something to pay attention to: if you see Alberti bass in a piece of music, it's normally broken chord accompaniment on a piano. And alongside this, with this new form of instrumental music, you have a lot more sonata-like multi-movement formats. You have like symphonies, string quartets, sonatas, and concertos. And the most significant form is the sonata form. Now, in the sonata form, there's the exposition, which is themes presented in contrast and keys. The development of the original theme in several keys, and the recapitulation, which is all themes restated in the home or tonic key only. So now, after this era, you kind of have the Romantic era, which is 1810 to about 1900. So the key features of this era would be more lyrical melodies using more chromaticism. Key changes were a lot more distant. So for example, in the classical period, there was a lot more modulation to the dominant key of the tonic key or the relative minor. But there's also like the use of third related key changes in the Romantic period, which is something to look out for definitely. There's a lot more chromatic harmony with extended chords, which use what are called tensions. So you have like 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths. A lot more strong dissonance. So you can tell the difference between this type of music and the Baroque era music because it does not really use the tonal system established in the Baroque era. There was an expansion of the orchestra to include more brass, so because of the introduction of valves. So this also means that there was a large increase in the number of strings within an orchestra to match the power of a brass section. So if you see like in both the use of a brass section and an increased number of strings, this could either be late classical because Beethoven used this kind of system, or it could be Romantic era. You also have the difference in range. So now you can have a difference between like 2-minute song and a 4-hour opera. So there's definite variance in the range of different genres within Romanticism. You have a lot of links to art and literature, as shown by things like the 4-hour opera, which create like program music, which is very important. You also have like the use of classical form that are modified to fit within the program, and there's like recurring themes to hold larger scale pieces together. And very important, there's a great increase in technical skill and virtuosity, particularly in the piano and violin. in which some pieces were considered unplayable. So if you see incredibly complex melodic lines that you could consider virtuosic, it's very possible that it's from this era, because this is an era in which this concept began cropping up more and more. Now, finally, we're going to go to the modern era, which is 1900 to present. So the modern era includes one, the beginning of atonality, which treated all notes of the chromatic scale as equal with no sense of tonic or dominant. You also have like the whole tone scale, and older systems such as modes were further used instead of the just Aeolian and Iolian. Now you have all the other modes being brought back from the Renaissance era. It was and I know the early 1900s were an era in which oftentimes traditional tonality was rejected in favor for particular like other systems like atonality and serialism. Melodies were more likely to be disconjunct with a lot of wider leaps. That was very important. Harmonies no longer subject to tonal relationships, they became more dissonant and became used purely for their own effects. So this is the birthing of non-functional harmony. There's a lot more energetic use of rhythm with things like cross rhythms, polyrhythms, odd and irrational time signatures, changes of meter and accent, very common. And then these changes of rhythm were also coupled with like an expansion of the percussion section in orchestra, and increased use of ethnic percussion instruments. And then there was also like a very large search for new timbre or new sound, use of traditional instruments, voices in new and unconventional ways, or they use newly invented instruments such as like sound recording and synthesis to shape and create like never before. And there are of course many sections to this. You have like Impressionism, you have the work of Arnold Schoenberg, you have Neoclassicalism, minimalism, and like experimental music, so like avant-garde. But if you're looking for modern music, it's often a major rejection of previously used tonal systems, and it's music which can be arguably far more complex than previously used. And if you want to look further into this section, I would recommend it. If you want it, some of it is rather confusing when you first listen to it. For example, if you were to listen to, freely atonal music, because of conditioning in the modern era, you probably would think of it not as music, but as just noise. So keep that in mind. And so now we're going to move on to the main features of jazz and popular music. Now, this is more so to teach you how to identify generally if something is jazz. In terms of particular eras, there are a lot of different eras. So you have like Dixieland jazz, you have big band, you have swing, you have bebop, you have hard bop, you have like modern jazz. There's a lot of variants of jazz. You have jazz fusion. But this is more so how you can identify that it is jazz rather than being classical, which is an important first step before you start going into figuring out what its subgenre would be. So first off, you have the use of something called a swing rhythm, which is when you have a slight shift, like an inequality in the spaces between notes. So rather than having like a straight rhythm, which would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, you'd have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, which it's slightly swung, and this kind of came from a lot of like Latin music, so it kind of drifted from things like samba and bossa nova, so that's very important to keep in mind. Sorry, it didn't come from that. It came from Latin rhythm, which further developed into bossa nova and samba. Now you also have the blue notes. Blue notes, very important. Keep that in mind. That phrase is very important. Blue notes, which is when the 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees of a scale are flattened to create further expression. If you see those in a piece of music in a particular key, and it's not really like a passing tone, it is most likely a blue note, it's most likely jazz. You have the use of the 12-bar blues progression, harmonic and structural progression, which is the chords go in a pattern of 1, 1, 1, 1, 4, 4, 1, 1, 5, 4, 1, 1, with one chord per bar. And then you also have changes in color from changing out these chords, for example, like a seventh, or replacing it with different chords or chord substitute. And you also have the use of a lot of improvisation. If you see improvisation like indicators in the piece of music, it's most likely jazz. Melodies and solos are developed from small motifs, which are referred to as riffs. In this case, you can refer to them as a riff within a piece of music. You have the increasing complexity of jazz harmony because it was borrowing chords from the Romantic and Modern era. Now you have like a system of notating these chords. Shorthand evolved later, so you have things like C minor, 7 flat 5. Now again, improvisation, very important in jazz. You have soloists or groups of soloists, solis, would base their improvisations on like blues scales or mode that fit with the underlying chord pattern. You have musicians like Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, Oscar Peterson, and Buddy Rich, who were known for their virtuoso improvisation. You have a lot of new playing techniques, so you have like brass and woodwinds, would bend pitches with fall-offs. So you have like other portamento techniques, which is a gradual transition between two pitches. You have like the use of mutes to alter brass tones. You have growling in instrumentation. You also have things like scat singing, which is using nonsense syllables in vocal improvisation. And you also have ensemble. You have frontline instruments such as saxophones, trumpets, and trombones, accompanied by a rhythm section, so like piano, guitar, bass or double bass, and drums. And you also had like clarinet and cornet as frontline instruments in earlier eras. And some rhythm sections use things like banjo and tuba. And most jazz ensembles were very small, except for big bands, which multiplied frontline instruments for a bigger sound. And then, as mentioned previously, you kind of have things like the Dixieland era is like the early, late 20th century pieces. It kind of all originated with piano rag, so ragtime of Scott Joplin in the 19th, 20th century. Then you kind of start developing into the Dixieland sound. You have big bands, definitely. You have their swing. After World War II, you get things like bebop, which have their own sections like hard bop. And then you have like modern jazz, like fusion, and there are a lot of different subgenres of jazz, which are very important to keep in mind and further look into. Now, off of jazz, you have popular music, which kind of comes from around the 1950s. Key features of popular music include structure built from sections. You have like introduction, verse, bridge, chorus, middle eight, instrumental, solos, coda, whatever, right? You have the use of common times. That's like 4 beats in a bar, with accents being on 2 and 4, or the backbeat. There is some use of slightly more like different time signatures, but more often than not, it is common time. And there's a lot of accenting and syncopation, which is very important. Melodies, riffs, and solos are based off of the blues scale and modes, including the pentatonic or 5-note mode. And performers often decorate their melodies with blue notes, grace notes, pitch bends, and portamento. There's a lot of harmonic vocabulary derived from Western classical music. However, it's more simple in popular music. There's no standard lineup for a pop group. It can include a lot of things: electric and acoustic guitars, bass guitar, drum kick, keyboards, like lead singers. Guitars are often separated into lead and rhythm parts, and then some of them require like a horn section, percussion, and backing vocals, and then there are some uses of like orchestral and ethnic instruments in particular pop songs. You have a big use of new technology, so things like synthesis, samplers, effects such as reverb, delay, and distortion, and like recording methods, which had a big impact. And you also have that pop singers mainly choose to use the chest and throat areas of the voice because they're more powerful. They do still use things like growls, screams, and falsetto to reach higher notes beyond the normal range, but chest and throat are very prominent. And there are the different variants of this. You have things like you have rock and roll originally, you have blues, and then from that you kind of get reggae, you get soul. Funk is kind of like a combo of jazz and pop music. You get things like progressive rock, punk rock, heavy metal. You get into hip hop in like the mid 70s, where there's a lot more use for like recording decks, drum machines, scratching, beatboxing, and then like call and response chants. And again, like the other sections, I recommend you look into all these subgenres specifically, so that you'll be able to identify them within your examination. And that's kind of the section on Western music, and then with the next episode I will begin going into world music, which is a section we should be more familiar with because it's more likely that we will be given a piece from an area of the world which is not the West. So with that, I say thank you and have a wonderful morning, afternoon, night, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for listening.